And the rain started. First time. Ladies and gentlemen, honoured guests, my name is Alistair Burtonshaw, and as the new director here at Charleston, I'm absolutely thrilled to be able to welcome you to a very special event with Melvyn Bragg, one of the UK's best-known broadcasters and authors. Melvyn's illustrious career began in 1961 as a general trainee at the BBC, forgive me, spending his first 2 years in radio at the BBC World Service, then at the BBC Third Programme and BBC Home Service. He then joined the production team of Hugh Walden's Monitor Arts series on BBC television and won an award for his screenplay on Debussy. He presented the BBC Books programme Read All About It and the Lively Arts, an arts series which included Who's Doctor Who, the earliest documentary on the television series. He was a long-standing head of arts and subsequently controller of arts at London Weekend Television. He's also known for his many programmes on BBC Radio 4, including Start the Week, The Roots of English, and In Our Time, which in March 2011 broadcast its 500th programme. In February 2012, he began Melvyn Bragg on Class and Culture, a three-part series on BBC Two, examining popular media culture with an analysis of the British social class system. In 2012, he brought back the South Bank show to Sky Arts 1, and in December 2012, he began The Value of Culture, a five-part series on BBC Radio 4, examining the meaning of culture, expanding on Matthew Arnold's landmark 1869 collection of essays, Culture and Anarchy. A novelist and writer of non-fiction, he has written a series of novels set in his home county, Cumbria, including Remember, and Grace and Mary, his latest novel. Alex Preston, writing in last weekend's Observer, described Grace and Mary as an insightful, moving tale of aging and our helplessness in the face of dementia, and also funny and sad and touching. The novel alternates between the present of 71-year-old John's visits to his 92-year-old mother, Mary, and the past, the story of his grandmother, Grace, which John uses to try to connect his mother to the past. So please do join me in offering a very warm welcome to Melvyn Bragg.
Thank you very much. You should have been warned that when I come here, I remember I had to recite as much as I could remember of those speeches of King Lear on the heath last time, shout them at the top of my voice about the rain pouring down, because it was the only thing that could get through. But they're sparing us at the moment. It's a mere winter mild shower in May instead of the thunderstorms we had then. I'm very pleased to be here. Again, who wouldn't want to come to this festival? It isn't quite big enough, this lectern. No, it's not criticising the lectern. I'm criticising my reliance on notes. I'm going to talk about this book, Grace and Mary, and read one or two bits from it, and then ask for questions. And if there aren't many questions, I'll read a bit more, and then we can all go and have a cup of tea. I'll look around the garden. It'll be refreshed, no doubt. And those of you, like myself, who didn't bring a coat or an umbrella or wellies, will be in for it. But there we are. Curious enough, although it's a short book, it spans over 100 years, 113 years. It's the most shaped and totally written book I've done. And I've written quite a few novels since I started writing when I was about 18 or 19. And there's quite a lot in it, so I'll be as elliptical as I can. But also the only point of coming to a festival like this, to talk to readers, which is what novelists nowadays, in my lifetime, have had the chance to do. Usually poets have always talked to readers. They've always been the cleverest. They have these poetry readings. They've had them since Homer. He was reading poetry all the time. And they read out to people who come and gather. Dramatists, you just pop into the theatre. Novelists usually delivered a novel, then were sent back to their attic to write another novel, and never met anybody. An occasional letter. Now we meet people who are readers. They're not necessarily my readers. Well, you never know, but not necessarily my readers. But they're certainly readers, which at least gets us somewhere along the line. And that's a joy. So the only point is to sort of try to give a parallel view of the book and read from it. And when I say parallel view, is to try to indicate where it came from, how it came, and what I tried to do with the material that disposed itself or put itself at my disposition. I wrote a book called Remember Me, which came out about 5 years ago, which was towards the end of a series had been Son of War, Soldiers Return, Son of War, Crossing the Lines, and then Remember Me, which is autobiographically based fiction, about which I have something to say, and if anybody wants to talk more about it, then please do. It's a form of, there are many forms of fiction. I've written historical fictions with Credo and Maid of Buttermere. There are all sorts of fictions, adventure stories and crime stories and thriller stories, and we got to the stage where we've stopped saying one is necessarily better than another. There are different genres. Autobiographical fiction always has an apologetic air, these days, because there are so many memoirs. And people say, well, why don't you just write it as a memoir and get it done with, instead of doing autobiographical fiction? And the answer to that for myself, and I think for others, and the people I most admire in literature over the last 100 or 200 years have written autobiographical fiction, although some of them don't like to admit it, but they have. I mean, Thomas Mann, early Tolstoy, it goes on, Lawrence and so on, it goes on, Roth nowadays and so on. The thing is that what happens, it seems to me, is this. I'm starting at the wrong end, but there you are, it's the rain that does it. What happens is two things happen. What I write is fiction. I'm a novelist. That's the way that I actually understand the world. Now that comes out of too much to talk about now, but comes out of my background, my inclination, only child, being rather lonely, but not at all worried about being lonely. I didn't care, I liked being on my own, and so on. And writing fiction, making things up, was my way of saying what I thought about the world. And I think that's what novelists are. We're just talking about the way we see the world, as painters are, as gardeners are in a way, very much in a way, and non-fiction writers are, and memoir writers are. Autobiographical fiction, I think, for me, has the strength of stratifications. I like to build a novel once I get the idea that sort of meant or hopes not only to come out of the impulse that gets it going, and the impulse of writing it, which is in that phrase of W.B. Yeats, a lonely impulse of delight. Not only just that, but built almost to last, built with strata. I like it to have time in it, to be of a specific time. And in this novel, the time is crucial. It is a time when we, the British and many others, we not more than any others, were an exceptionally cruel society in many ways. A young woman had an illegitimate child before and during and after the First World War, and before then, and in many places, she was branded for life, and she and the child had to separate. Certainly in my little town of 5,000 people. So the time is very important, and also for me the landscape's very important, because I like to see where people are when I'm writing about them. I like to see the streets, the fields, the towns. I like to feel the weather. We have plenty of this where I come from, up in Cumberland. That's why we've got the lakes. And I like to feel the weather in the town. But I also think that if I base it on stories that I experienced, and I don't mean that I necessarily went through, but that I heard about and absorbed and were part of the culture in which I was brought up, then they'll have a chance of having a base that when I go for them and try to write the fiction on top of them, means that they can float and go down the slipway and maybe go somewhere down the river towards some sort of sea. I hope that makes sense. But I'll try to give one quick analogy as to what I think happens in autobiographical fiction. And I found it quite recently through Darwin. As you know, Darwin, the evolution and so on, what bothered him, what took him so much time to get going, was it took so much time. He knew it had taken millions and millions of years, especially after he'd been to Wales and studied geology there. But he couldn't see the millions and millions of years as clearly as he wanted to. He couldn't see evolution. He knew it was there, but he couldn't. When he went to the Galapagos, he saw it. And one way he saw it was on one island. He collected animals and birds, particularly, as you know, when he went there. One of the first islands, he collected a finch. And an island away, a long way away, finches must have been blown there by the wind. There's another finch, not quite like the first finch, but still related. And so it went on, another finch, till it got to the final island. And there was a directly related finch to fit the first, but it was so different that it couldn't even mate with the first finch. And that, I think, is what happens when you write autobiographical fiction. You start with somebody, yourself, or in my case, my mother in this case, and my grandmother that I didn't know, and by the time it's become a work of fiction, it's a different thing altogether. And that's what's happening here. This book began when I'd stopped writing fiction because I was caved out after a Remember Me novel, and I wrote non-fiction, a book about King James Bible, which took a while. And then I started to see a woman. Now, this isn't spooky and it isn't magic, and I started to see, you know that moment when you wake up but you don't get up, if you're lucky, but it's a good time to browse, really, and you browse and graze around your what's left of your mind after a night of non-sleep with all these cosmic rays going through you and frightening you to death and one thing like that. But I began to see this woman of a certain age, an elderly woman, an old-fashioned woman, wandering around the lanes of a little cottage that Kate and I, my wife and I, have had up in the Lake District for more than 40 years. It's in a hamlet, goes onto a fell. And I wondered who she was. There was a big house near us which was burnt down. And one or two of the great houses in Cumbria at the time used to be host to the German High Command before the First World War. And they would come over and say lots of photographs of related family relationships, and they came for the shooting and so on, shooting of animals. And just clarify that as we go along. And I thought she might have been a servant or somebody in that big house. And she drifted through, and it took me quite a while, and I wasn't in any rush. It was like pulling in a kite quite carefully, and I thought, I know she is. She's my grandmother. That's who she is. And she's the grandmother that I met 3 times, if I remember correctly, and misremembering is a great part of autobiographical fiction and very valuable. But I met her 3 times for about 20 minutes a time in my life. And she would come into the most unused room in our house, which is a small house above a pub, flat above a pub, and my mother would bring her in and walk out and leave her with me. I don't remember much, to tell you the truth. I know she had her hair parted in the middle, which is old-fashioned, I thought. I sat saying, I can't remember a word I said. I just remember she was a nice woman. And then she went, and I didn't know who she was. You know Dickens' great phrase about English literature is streaky bacon. It's what the French hate about us. It's high and then it's dreadful. And Shakespeare has as well. You've got comedy and next to tragedy. Well, that was a solemn moment for me. I didn't know I was solemn. But all I can really remember is the streaky bacon bit, that when she left, she gave me a brown envelope with a 10-bob note in it. A 10-bob note in the late 40s and early 50s. So there she was. When I was 18 or 19, my mother said that's my mother, she said, my real mother. And I should have told you a long time ago. And left the room. And I was grown up then, so I was off to university and then off to London. I didn't follow it up at all, but it must have bedded itself in. And the notion of why this woman who was my mother's mother, because everybody was family in that little town of 5,000 people. They didn't all like each other. It was no means ideal, but people were rummaging around each other all the time. There's gossip everywhere, but I never had any gossip whatsoever about this. Here we go, King Lear. Any gossip whatsoever about this? None. And yet, she'd been part of my mother's life, I presumed, and I went away. And I wrote other things. And it turned out that she had been... I found out 2 or 3 things about her, again by accident, about 6 or 7 years ago. Somebody in the Telegraph wrote a column like, "Who do you think you are?" that sort of thing, and tracked back, without asking permission, the lives of people that they fancied tracking back. They tracked back my life. Well, I didn't want them to do that. I know who I am. I don't want somebody else to tell me. But apart from that, they mentioned that my father had done this, and my mother had worked in a factory, and my mother was illegitimate, it said. And her mother had been this woman whose mother had died when she was born and had been brought up by her grandparents. By her grandparents. Can you still hear me at the front? Never mind. Brought up by her grandparents in a little village. They're small-time farmers. I was incandescent about that because the word illegitimate appeared in the paper in connection with my mother. And this is one of the remarkable things. I had never heard that mentioned in the town. Now, this was as gossipy a town as any other. Not more, not less, but gossipy. Especially in the 30s, 40s, and 50s when it was very close together, that town. I never heard that. I'd been protected from that, as it turned out, I think. Anyway, there it was. So then my mother entered into a stage of dementia when she was about 89 for 6 years. And I used to go up and down to see her in Cumberland from London. She was in an extremely good home. It was, if you could pay, you did, and if you didn't, it was National Health. It's a wonderful home by the sea in a place that she knew very well, just a few miles from where she'd been brought up. And I was with her and talking to her and seeing her go through the several different changes and moods of not losing her mind, but gaining different personalities, going in and out of personality. She was a woman who said no complaints, whatever you asked her. How are you? No complaints. She was extraordinarily stoic. She was very funny. She was very funny at my expense. She cut me off at the knees all the time and never stopped making me laugh. But it was in and out. Some days she was like this, some days she was like that. You went back, as some of you might know, and you'd been out for a walk because she was asleep, and you came back and she didn't know you, and she told you off, or she said, "Where have you been? You never come to see me." That sort of thing which all of you know about. But the daily exchanges were wonderful in a way, because life kept pulsing through and taking different directions, and bits of her personality that I never knew about came through. Not revelations, not secrets, it's moods and it's nuances, and it's an idea of who this woman whom I thought I knew very well was. I suppose, looking back, at that time I thought I knew her better than anybody I would ever know. My dad was in the war, so I was brought up with her. Like millions of people, I slept in the same bed as her while I was little, and then in the same room as her. We lived in a one-up, one-down cottage, or house, whatever they called those slums in those days. And when she had to make a living as a cleaning, she would put me on the back of the bike on the pillion, and I'd take me around, to my great delight, to these houses, and I'd run around while she cleaned it. So I was very, very close to her in all sorts of ways. But never as close as in those last years, because alone with her, trying to study her, trying to work out what was going on in her mind, trying to see how I could help, if I could help. And I could sometimes, and sometimes I was out of my depth, and wondering what was happening to her mind in that case, in that state. So there's that. And there was this other woman, whom I called Grace. That was Mary. I called my mother Mary. So one of her names was Mary, Mary Ethel. She hated Ethel. I don't know why. It's a great Anglo-Saxon name, but still she did. And Grace, my grandmother, whom I knew these things, that her mother had died when she was born. It's not miserable, is this. These are two women of enormous spirit. Given the strictures of the time, they led spectacularly ordinary lives. Of great spirit, they didn't give in, they got on with their lives, they did things, and so there's Grace there, and it's been told from the point of view of somebody like myself. So there's somebody like myself, there's somebody like my mother, and there's somebody who's my grandmother. It's three sorts of storytelling in a way, because my grandmother Grace is a story that I tell from the beginning of her life, making it up completely. All I knew about her was that her mother died when she was born, brought up by her grandparents in a little village, which I happen to know 2 miles from my own town, and that she'd had this illegitimate child when she was 18 or 19, and left the town, or been asked to leave the town, or forced to leave the town. That's all I knew. So I made up a life for her. My mother, who's intercut with this, I thought I knew her, but she was seeping away and coming back, and it's a strange thing. It's a strange thing to see a personality change, and to keep loving the different personalities. And not to know what to do, and yet being there was enough to do, except sometimes it wasn't. sometimes being there, there was a stoniness about it, and so on. So there were different moods there. So I put the stories together and made the man who's telling the story, who was based on me, trying to do something. He's trying to rescue his mother's memory. She wants to know about her mother. So that brings the three of them together. That's what's going on. I'm going to read a little bit from the start, just to give you some idea of what it was, rather what it was like. Although, yes, what it was like. What I remember, or what I've turned into fiction, what it was like. The mother and son meet mostly in the middle of the last century, after the war. Her disintegrating memory can still take her there, and he'd been old enough to store up sharp impressions of the life around him. It gives them an illusion of equality. Together, they can make that place a time to live in. It was then that they were mother and child. Now she's in her 10th decade, he'd just gone 70, and slowly the roles are reversing. More than 60 years have passed, but as her life enters into darkness and silence, they can still draw warmth from the ember of those days. Occasionally they chant the present. Sometimes they sing. Mary's voice, thinner now, is still certain and pure. The melody steadily held as she sits up in her bed and sways to the tune, the words coming from the heart as she smiles at him. Daisy, Daisy, give me your answer, do. I'm half crazy, all for the love of you. He joins in. It won't be a stylish marriage. I can't afford a carriage. But you look sweet upon the seat of a bicycle made for two. Her laughter, delighted, crystalline, stops abruptly. I hope nobody hears us. What if they did? They would throw us out. Throw us right out. They might like it. They might take a collection. The worst thing your father ever did was to get that tandem. Why was that? Again. He wants the story again. He wants all her stories again. Tandems pull ahead of the others. I always wanted to be among them. And when he was on an evening shift, I couldn't go out. She shrugs, mild now. I like biking a lot more than your dad did. Another mouthful? She pulls back her head and looks down on the spoon of ruby-coloured jelly. Just one more, come on. He pulls his chair a nudge closer to the bed and carefully aims the spoon at her tight lips. The rest of the meal is scarcely touched. The last one, he lets the silence stretch and holds her look. Promise? Yes, he says. Still she hesitates, eyes him even more intensely, and then swoops like a bird pecking, jutting out her tongue, and as he tilts the spoon, allows the glistening ruby jelly to slide into her mouth. She swallows it slowly. No more, she cries, covering her mouth with her hand. No more. He keeps his word. She looks out of the window a while. Look at that beautiful tree, she says, and adds in sudden alarm, what will we do without trees? Tears fill her eyes, and she appeals to him. There'll always be trees. Will there? Oh, will there? I hope so. He nods, suddenly overcome, as happens, by her plight, her sweetness, her helplessness, the ebbing, this dying of the light, such a light, flickering bravely still. Then he goes out while she falls asleep, comes back, let's say 20 minutes later, and he says hello. Hello, he said. He took her mottled hand. It was cold. He rubbed it. It's John. John? No, it isn't. It is. You're not. There was a sorrow, but there was a calm also. His task was to take her away from this confused present, to lead her into the past, which could be patched up or made up or truly remembered, but above all safe. Safe, 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 and away from the abyss that threatened. Who am I then? He smiled. It wasn't a false encouragement. It suggested a game that might help take the curse off it. Well, she cupped and rested her chin on her left hand and considered him as if he were a dog she were judging in a show. Let's see your feet. He pushed back his chair and lifted them. Black brogue shod. She scrutinized them. They're very big, she said. They're just normal. They're big. He waited. You're a Johnson, she said. That you are. That's who you are. You're a Johnson. I'm not. He knew about the Johnsons. You are. She turned her face into the pillow, thought she was set for sleep, but she was sobbing. Then again he leaned forward and she said, I want my mother. He heard himself ask, which one? She stirred and looked at him, but what did she see? "My own," she said, "my own mother. I want Grace to come and see me. Can you bring her? I want my mother." Once more she turned away and put her white head into the white pillow, and this time she slept, leaving him with the burden of the request. Maybe they could share an imagined world now. Maybe his thoughts could become her thoughts. For where was she in that dark place but still drifting forward, like a small boat on a black glass of water? Could he not in some way reach her, even there, out of his own darkness? Could he not put together a memory for her? Perhaps he could become her memory, to build it from fragments, or make it up, and most of all, bring back Grace, her own mother. So that's what he starts to do, write about Grace. And the conceit is, the idea of the book is that while he's writing it, he's telling her about her mother, what her mother did, and so on. And he pursues ways of helping his mother in the book, far more formally, far more steadily than I did. And he finds other ways. He finds them most by accident. He's in a shop buying the Cumberland News, which is the local paper, which I used to take along to my mother every time. And she'd better eyesight than I have. Even when she was 95, she could read this classified as in the Cumberland News, which is a test of anybody, smaller than anything you get at any optician anywhere. And that was always a delight, because I'd come to the property. She liked looking at houses, but you'd be scandalised that houses were costing £55,000 in Carlisle. It's a fortune, she said. Who can afford this? This is just for millionaires. What are people going to do? And so we went through that. And I bought a book of photographs of Old Wigton, the town that she was brought up in. Photographs of about her time and a little before her time. And it was magical. It was magical. I can remember, that I can remember. Well, I mess around with it. You mess around, your memory changes all the time. We all know our memory meets the occasion. It slides around. It's not a little steady reservoir. It's a gurgle and a waterfall and swirls of rain and that. But still I can remember that, because she looked at it and she said, "How much did you pay for this?" I said, "Well, it wasn't very much." "It must have cost a fortune." "It's a wonder. It must have cost a fortune." And then she looked and she said, "If you wave a magic wand," well, I think she said that. I don't think whether she did. In the book it said, "If you made a magic wand, they'd all come alive." And she looked through and saw photographs of that person and that, and it was wonderful. And then she got tired. But that set me off thinking, when I was writing the book, and I finished it before she died, and obviously wouldn't have published it until she died, and I wish she hadn't died. When I followed the book, set me off thinking, maybe there are ways that you could reconstitute memory. Maybe there's ways of finding out. You can replace limbs, you can replace all sorts of other things. Why couldn't you replace memory? Why couldn't you shore that up? If it's a physical thing inside us, like blood is a physical thing, why couldn't you do something about it? I mean, they try to do it, neuroscientists are trying to do it, we know that, and so on. But why can't we do it ourselves in an amateur way? Some of the best things that have happened in this country in science have come from amateurs trying in their way. Just anyway, that's as may be. That's one thing that happened there. And so he's talking to her there. It's difficult to say this. It isn't difficult to say. It's difficult to say it accurately. That I was imagining her when I was writing the book. Even when I was seeing her, I still had to imagine it. There was this man who went in and looked at this woman as I was writing the book in London, writing pages of it. I never kept any notes. And he just said, I wonder what she's thinking. I wonder what you'd say then. And snippets that are in there, I'm sure she said, and snippets I'm sure I made up. And I began to think that imagination, memory and imagination are just more or less the same thing. They converge. They're both infinite. They both go into directions you can't tell where they're going to go. They both are storage systems which we know so little about. I mean, everybody in this room has imagination. Every single one of us has imagination. It can take us anywhere we want in seconds. It can take us back to the Big Bang faster than the speed of light. It can take us into the minds as we think of other people. It takes us into the minds of created characters in novels. It can take us into history. Take us all over the place. Newton said when he was asked how he'd arrived at the theory of gravity, this colossal notion, and he did maintain that he saw an apple drop in the garden when he was a 21-year-old come back home from Cambridge because of the plague that hit Cambridge at that time. From that, he imagined a law which explained the entire universe He didn't have the stuff to see it. He worked it out. He imagined it. And he was asked how he'd arrived at it by somebody, and he said, by thinking on it continually. And in Shakespeare, you have the idea of the poet conjuring up words, imagining words. It's an extraordinary faculty. It's what drives us forward. And I think it's interspersed with memory. We reach into that resource we have and bring things up like from the deep and look at them and throw them back. And we're doing it all the time. And I remember this, and we misremember. And all that is muddled in together. And if you're lucky, you can make something of it. And you can not only stabilize your life, but enrich your life, because the best of our lives are interior lives. And those two things combine. And what's going to happen when it's unleashed, imagination? People who know what they're talking about, say that we use about 5% of our minds. Well, it's interesting that we're also supposed to know about 5% of the universe. It's an interesting match. But what's going to happen when we know something of the other 95%? It'd be a great reason for sort of believing in reincarnation, wouldn't it? You come back and see what's going on. But there we are. I don't know where that one came from, but still. It leads you to think about how people's minds work, what your affections are, what this or that means. The big questions that have pursued everyone since we know about civilization, since we read anything about any civilizations. I was talking about it this morning, about Claude Lévi-Strauss. For 8,000 years, they're asking exactly the same questions. Exactly the same questions, and they're providing answers which depend on the context of their information. What they've got, they answer with. And it might be that God is a tree for some people, but it's the same answer to the same questions. And we're trying to figure out why we're here and why we have this excess, this intensity of curiosity. And then it turns out this excess, this intensity of knowledge. So that was partly with her. With Grace, it was a much more, not a straightforward story, but it was a story of trying to imagine what a young woman who came from poorish circumstances, was brought up by very good grandparents, by the sound of it. They took her and 3 of her brothers on when they were in their 60s. And she worked at the farm, and then she, as they would say, got into trouble. Well, it was I had to make up where that came from and how it came from and what happened to her. And that was a joy. And I think one of the things that interests me when I look back in it, because I wrote it several times, is the bits that I'd made up completely, as it were, from Grace, and the bits that I'd, as it were, taken from my mother, began to intermingle. And I couldn't begin to tell which were more made up than others. It had all turned into a similar fiction. And what happened, as I said, was that Grace had this illegitimate child and left the town, and my mother was fostered. And I do know that because I was told much later, it's very strange the secrets that towns can keep. Tom Keneally is here, and he's talking about in his novel, a secret that was kept for a very long time. It's secrets that they can keep. I can't imagine how they did it. And I really can't imagine how they did it. I'd like to be able to. But not only did my mother somehow or other keep them from telling me by her presence until I was 18. How did somebody not tell me? I don't mean because I'm an important bloke, but just to tease me or to be horrible or to be nasty or to confide. And you know your mother was and they wouldn't use illegitimate, they'd use a much crueler word than that. They didn't. They honestly didn't. And it seems to me, her strategy was extraordinary. Because when she was 11 or 12, a school teacher told me this, who'd been her school teacher and my school teacher at the junior school. When he was an old man, he said she was very clever and we thought she was going to get a scholarship. But when she was 11 or 12, she faded away. And that was the time when she learned that she was illegitimate. And she had been called that horrible name in the school play. I made it up that she'd called it in the school playground. I didn't know what happened, but she learned that. And she changed her direction. She left school at 14, went to work in the factory where all the women work. They made clothes. She made buttonholes in the clothes for 8 years until she married Dad. And as soon as she got married, you got fired in those days. And you got a prodded rug or another present as you went your way. She was with all the girls in that room, women in that room, and everybody knew. But she braved them. She went in the cycle club and everybody knew. She went to dances, and everybody would know, and she would know that they would know, and she kind of took them on. That isn't strongly enough stressed in the book because it's not a memoir. But the more I think about it, the more that surges up as an example of some sort of determination that she was going to live the life she wanted to live, which was a spectacularly ordinary life. And as for Grace, I don't know how these people did it. She accepted that that was that and moved away to let her child be brought up as they thought properly and rightly, but i.e. not by her, and that she not to be in the equation. Now, I assume in that she's an intelligent, powerful young woman. Here's a little bit about Grace. She's been on this farm for a long time. Well, for a long time in her life, since she was a child, and she's now about 17 or 18, and the World War I has started, and her comment is everything in the world has changed except Olton. That was the village she lived in. And she wants to go out of it. And she'd done well at school, but she had been involved in something, not nasty or anything, that stopped her staying on. And nearby, I've made this up, nearby there's a huge house which is turned into a secondary convalescent home in the novel. And that is to say, people were badly injured, they went to places to be repaired, then they came to these homes to rest for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, however long it took. And this was owned by a woman who turns out to be a very benevolent and helpful woman, and Grace got a job there as a maid and turned into a sort of semi-nurse, the way a lot of young women did in the war. And she's going off for her first day at work. She worked on the farm first. And I think this gives you some idea of what I thought Grace was like and must have been like. I hope it does. It gave me some idea. Grace had never felt so free. The bicycle sped down the long, shallow hill, her coat flowing like a cloak, the summer dawn not long broken. She heard all about her what seemed to her to be a round of applause in the hedges, in the fields, and the trees, as strengthening light brought the awakening of freedom and the noise of greetings. She had the phrase in her head, and the birds of the air, and everything that crawled on the face of the earth, and she was at the heart of it. The village she had left behind her was stirring into labour, the horses being fed, the breakfast cooked, but it was behind her. She was leaving it. Down she swept on the sturdily reconstituted bone shaker, pedalling hard even though there was no need, urging it on, urging herself on in this new freedom towards this new life. Life was so strong in her it couldn't be contained, and her body ached with it. Suddenly she shouted, then sang, loud as she could, sounds of soprano happiness pealing across the fields, part of the waking strains of the early morning land. The house was no more than 3 miles away, and once she turned off the main road to Wigton, she found herself in narrow lanes, tunnels of trees, bulging summer hedges, flower-thickened banks, no soul stirring, no sound save for the clamour of the birds. It was like a secret passage that would suddenly reveal a great wonder, and it did. And Grace is going, interesting for me, that I could partly do that because of memory as well as imagination. I had a girlfriend in Oakland for 3 years when I was at school, or well, towards the end of school, whatever it was anyway. And I would come back as late as I could at night to go back to Wigton and come out of her farm, and her father's farm, tenanted, and come out of her farm and make for that hill, the hill that took you down into Wigton. And it was a long, shallow hill. And I can see it now. And I probably got it wrong. There's a house on that corner and a house. And it was a wonderful hill to ride down on a bike, especially after you'd been with, you know, your girlfriend. What the heck? And you just swooped down and you pedalled even though you were going quite fast, and swerved round the corner, and you were in a place that had scarcely changed literally for centuries then. It was still old-fashioned farming. There was still a few horses in the fields, and it was that deep English boskiness that was there. And I felt that, and I was thinking about not what to do with Grace. I just wanted Grace to, I knew she wanted to move on. I thought, well, if she moved on, where would she go? And how would she get there? Well, she'd walk or she'd bike. But if she biked, there would be this sensation of freedom and release, because you had it. Those of you who could get out of a bike, it gave you that sometimes. So that came out of that. So the things are mingling, my memory and a sort of imagination. There's quite a lot more to say, but I'd rather take your questions in a way, because it's mainly these two women and myself examining it. And it's trying to say, these are people. It's trying to say, this is the human condition as I knew it. I experienced it partly myself, but I experienced the experience of others. And there it was there, and now it's out there. And the attempt is to shove it down, and as I said very early on, see if it'll float somewhere. What I want finally to say is that it's not only not a memoir, it's not miserabilist in the slightest. These two people are wonderful, and they feel it in themselves, or I feel it for them. So one last little bit, and then for any questions. And this is this. This is when it goes back and forward, but I'm told by Pat Parker and one or two others that it's perfectly easy to follow. Goes back and forward, and this is John when he's a boy, and his mother Mary, and he is describing a time just after the war when she used to take him to places. The boy and his mother set off just after 7 on a winter evening that suited the look and the mood of the post-war town. 3 years after the victory over Germany, the town remained immured and frozen in the consequences of a mid-century maelstrom. Though the blackout blinds had been removed, it still seemed like blackout. The council house yard in which they lived was pitch, and they needed the small torch. The streets were ill-lit by gas lamps at thrifty intervals, the pools of dark predominating on the windows of the locked and bolted shops. Above them, in the flats, the owners showed their presence by the dim yellow glow of gaslight through the curtains. The fragile little globes of the mantels plopped into a feeble flame all over the town, and yet the impression was of overwhelming darkness, the gas subdued, as if in sorrow. They walked quickly. Mary, a bonny young woman in her late 20s, the luxuriant black hair, the fine skin, the body lean from work and the prescriptive diet of rationing. The boy, aged 8, in short pants, allowed his Sunday suit for this occasion, hair plastered flat with water and a stiff comb, grey socks up to the knees, shoes shining. He was excited, and Mary had to step out to keep up with him. The lure was the hand-painted poster stuck outside the Spanish fish and chip shop, alongside the much bigger poster advertising the 3 films coming to the Palace Cinema that week. It read, "Pea and pie supper. Bring your own knife and fork. Proceeds to the social fund, adults 1 shilling, children and others 3pence. Dancing to the 2 Wigton Mashers. All welcome at the Wigton Congregational Church, 7 p.m, Tuesday the 10th. Like the prey to a hawk, like the fox sent to a hound, this poster, once John had confirmed that his mother would take him, inflamed the small boy's desire. Dancing, and out late, with a band. Few aristocratic private parties, or courtly levees, or gatherings of swells in legendary hotels, or the massed horsey packs at county hunt balls had been as passionately anticipated as this. With a pea and pie supper thrown in, his mother let him carry the knives and forks." Thank you. Okay, I'll try to answer questions if anybody has any. You could be lucky. Yes.
Thank you very much. There's a fascinating insight into the human psyche. You mentioned, you imagined someone in the big house that burnt down. In 1957, that happened to be our house.
Was it? Are you a gurney? Really? Well, I hope you weren't in it.
but the reason I asked the question is Hugh Walpole obviously wrote the Harry's Chronicles, and the fortress being based on that house. Did you draw some influence from local writers in all your various writings along the way? Did you play a part in that? Or?
Well, fancy meeting you.
Yeah.
You never know, do you? I thought we Cumbrians only met each other around Wigton. That's right, yeah. Right influence. I think, as Tom will tell you, that once you start somehow or other thinking that you're going to be a writer. Now, I didn't, first of all, you read your head off. So what influences you? I'd love to say, from the age of 7, I was deeply influenced by the Old Testament. But actually, it was probably by the Beano. You never know what's influencing you. You read and read and read. And to separate out influences, which some writers do, I believe them up to a point where I say, come on. I mean, I know you're reading the news of the world as well, or whatever. So it's difficult to... But putting it, there's a certain stage in adolescence, in my case, and in the case of some other, well, let's talk about me because that's what I'm here for, aren't I? And there's actually very few writers have anything in common except they write. If anybody tells you this is the way to write, they're right and they're wrong, because somebody will tell you the opposite thing next time and they'll be right and wrong too. There isn't one way to write, there's your way to write, and that's it. It's like fingerprints. I think when you're about 16 or 17, you tense up around it. It's rather like getting to know a girl for the first time properly. And you think, maybe I'm going in that direction. I don't quite know why I'm going in that direction. So you start to read in a different way. You do. And you start to read like a hunter. And you look for stuff. And I, for instance, I found Russian stuff. Stuff that I wasn't getting at school. Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. Sorry about this, but I did. And Lermontov and Pushkin. And loved it. Partly because it wasn't us. And I'd had so much of us at school. I was taught English very, very well at that grammar school. I mean, really well. Properly, by a good school teacher, a Yorkshireman, Arthur Tillotson Blacker, who'd been in Czechoslovakia in the Second World War. We thought he was a hero. Probably was, actually. So I found that, and I was going there for something or other. Then French literature, in English, but in translation, but there we go. So you're looking for that, and then you're finding echoes. Not obviously, but when I read Hardy, I thought, oh, yes, it's a place. We can have a place like that. And early D.H. Lawrence, the sort of fever of intensity of the intense cohabitation. So you're beginning to assemble some kind of literary genealogy. But I still think it's rather mushy. When you start to write, which I did when I was 18 and a half, properly write. I started from just turning out poetry for the school magazine. When I was at university and I had time on my own, more than on my own, time to myself, I started to write stories. Then you organize your own thoughts and you still look to other writers, but you're on your own. That's the point. That's part of the point. I sometimes think that one of the reasons I write is to be on my own, as much as being on my own to write. I think, and so, right, to be sensible. In Cumberland, as you must know, if you don't, you've got to make a decision about Wordsworth. Because every time you win an English prize, you get another 19th century compendium of Wordsworth, and they stack up, I can tell you. I don't know why people who buy prizes in schools are so short. I've got such short memories. You know, I had one of those last year. Anyway, so you've got to make a decision. And my decision was, well, I'll learn this. And then I read the Prelude. And I'd had not nervous trouble. I mean, I played rugby and stuff, and I didn't tell anybody at the time. And I had a sort of breakdown without telling anybody. I think we were very good at our family not telling anybody anything about anything, because I was in real trouble. But I read the Prelude, and there's passages in the Prelude where Wordsworth is saying what I was feeling. And when anybody reads something like that in a novel, you think, yes, that's the truth. And that's the way the novels, I think, can tell truths that very other forms can. So Wordsworth was there, then Lawrence was there, and then I was kind of up and running, really. I was getting hold. Then Americans, because Hemingway and Scott Fitzgerald and Hawthorne and so on. You just the stuff piles in. And so I think it would be pretentious to say what influenced me. But I know which writers I admired, but that changes a lot of the time. And then you just gather around yourself and try to shape your own sentences and think the only thing you can do is what you can do. Took me quite a long time to accept that. Because at the start, when you start, you want to do what other people do. You want to imitate other people. Oh, that's a great writer. I'll try to write like him. Oh, she's a great writer. I'll try to write like her. And you do that. Writers have always imitated at the beginning. Well, not always, but many of them have done. And then you settle down. I'll tell you what influenced me a lot. When I went to university, at the Oxfam shop, you got paperbacks for 6pence. which was great. And the deal was, and it was a good deal, that when you left the university, you gave them all back to the Oxfam shop. And I bought masses of plays. We didn't have a proper theatre in Cumberland. Well, we didn't have a theatre in Cumberland that you could go and see plays. We'd been read Shakespeare in school, and we'd done Shakespeare at school. But there's stuff by Chekhov and Ibsen and Tennessee Williams, and I loved reading those plays, and particularly Chekhov. So all that stuff's milling around. Fancy you coming from High Ivy? We must be the only two people in the universe who know where High Ivy is. It's only got 6 houses. Well, I'll tell Kate as soon as I get back. In fact, I'll ring her up.
You mentioned quite briefly that you wouldn't have published this book while your mother was still alive. And I was just interested in that line between writing about somebody's life and fictionalising it, because there is no kind of ethical code for a writer, but were there kind of areas that were off limits that you wouldn't have included? Like, or did you kind of say, like, set rules for yourself about how much kind of truth you would put in, I suppose?
No, in the off chance that it might have upset her in some way, I wouldn't publish it. It was as simple as that. It wasn't a very complicated decision. It wasn't a complicated decision at all. I just didn't want anybody to say, even accidentally, Melvyn's written a book about you, because that might have alarmed her. So that's why she had a very idiosyncratic take on my books, my mother. I've no idea whether she read any, but I read a book called The Soldier's Return, which was based, when my dad died, I realised that I hadn't known him, obviously, till I was about 7, and then he worked so hard, and I went away when I was 18, and I think he was waiting for me to grow up so we could talk to each other properly. He didn't have much time for children. He was a very, very good man. He was a good man. But, you know, he liked to take me to football matches or to hound trails or to point-to-points where he'd give me some money. Go and look, back these 6 horses and you won't do too badly. I'll meet you at the gate at 2.5 hours' time, that sort of thing. That was his idea of a big day out. The only time I ever went on a holiday with my dad outside, well, we never went on one holiday. I used to go to holidays to Butlins with my mother and Morecambe occasionally with my mother. And my mother bullied him, because they never went together because of the pub and that. And bullied him to take me to Blackpool for 2 days. We were supposed to go for 5 days, Monday to Friday. And we got there, and on Tuesday or Wednesday morning, I remember I was about 11 or something, 12, and I misremember this. And if I misremember or remember, I don't care, because it's true. I was looking at him over this breakfast we ate in silence in this boarding house, you know, boiled egg and I looked at him and I saw such long-suffering boredom on his face at the idea of having to spend another day with this boy. Oh, God. I mean, anyway, so we're walking along the front at Blackpool, and the people I admired most in my life at that time were the Slater family, who had the fun fair, and they camped in Wigton. That's where they wintered. Just we had travellers who camped in Wigton in Black Tipper behind the cemetery. So we had anyway, and those Slater boys were wonderful. They had long hair. They wore silk scarves. They jumped on and off the speedway without paying. I mean, God. I mean, what do you want? And the Slater boys. And in a little shop with one of those brown Rayfane things so that the sun couldn't get... Fancy defending yourself against the sun in Blackpool. Can you think? I mean, only years later do I see. Anyway, there was a with a bright yellow sweater. I mean, it was love at first sight. And Dad saw me looking at it, and he was very clever. And he said, "You want it?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "If I buy it for you, can you go back today? Can we go back today? And will you, when I say to Mum, you'd had enough, will you just not say anything?" And so I bought it, and I put it, of course, on top of my shirt, and went back on the train, marched into the house. You can get that off right away. So that was that. I mean, I had to sneak it out of the back window if I wanted to wear the yellow sweater. But when I did The Soldier's Return, I was a bit worried because it was my first self-consciously autobiographical novel. Autobiography had been sprinkled through a lot of my early books, as it is through the books of far more writers than will admit it. It's all over the place. It's part of your material. Your own material is inside your head, and most of what's inside your head is your experience of yourself. I mean, you know, we're more interested in ourselves than in anybody else. We don't like to admit it, but we are. And that had gone on, but this was thing. Somebody came back from the war, kind of the house, and I said, you've got to be, you know, it isn't. I find it difficult to talk to my mother when she wasn't here. Imagine when she was here. I said, Dad comes around. It starts with this man coming back from the war, and he comes around the corner in a council house yard with a thing over his shoulder, kit bag over his shoulder, and we're on the steps of the house, and that's how it starts. And it isn't Dad really, because it isn't Dad at all, because it moves into. And she just looked. I mean, the basilic, I think, got lessons from her. And she said, it wasn't like that at all. I said, well, it wasn't like that at all. And then she said a sentence that must have rung through Western literature since Homer. I mean it. And she said, we got word the men were coming home. And that wars after wars in Western Europe, the men went to it and the men came home. And the next one, I don't know whether any of you know this phrase, but here goes. And she said, so we got up a bus. Now, I'll leave it to you to interpret yourself, but it meant that everybody whose husbands were coming home clubbed together, and they took a bus to Carlisle, 11 miles away, which was a massive railway town in those days. They built engines. It was, and they went down. Now, I was insane, sort of, not insane, that's silly, very, very keen on trains. And we lived in Station Road. At the bottom of the bottom of the road was the railway. My Uncle John, who wasn't my Uncle John, everybody I knew wasn't. I mean, it's been an unlearning process on a very high scale, I tell you, and I'm still unlearning. I know. Anyway, he was a very nice man, my uncle, non-Uncle John, and I would get up on this little fretwork bridge, and he would phone down to Braithwaite or Spatria and say, when you go into that bridge in Wicken, would you just let some steam off, because there's a little boy on that, and just let us come. So I would stand on the bridge, and I tell you, I've read in Plato about somebody ascending into heaven with steam. It's not that, can't compare. That was mere mist, and that compared with the steam that I was covered in, or Wicken Railway Station. I was mad. Well, I went to Carlisle. Dad came back on a train. We must have gone back to Wigton. I saved up some spam, a double tea, and all that. I can't remember a thing about it. It must have been the biggest day in my life, my long life, by miles. Been nothing to compare with it. I still can't remember anything about it at all. All I remember is what my mother told me. So I'd got it wrong. I was so relieved that I got it wrong. I could say, but that's, you see what I mean? It isn't, it isn't. So she looked at me rather beadily. And a week or two later, I rang her up, because I rang her up a lot, most days, and she said, how are you getting on? Well, it was all right. She's getting on with the book. And so I thought, well, I won't talk about it. But about 2 or 3 weeks later, I plucked up courage, said, come on, you know, are you a man or are you a mouse? How's it how are you reading them? How's it going? I'm plodding on. So there you are. That's encouragement for you. It was great. So, I don't know what the question was now. Anyway, yes.
I wonder how objective you can be. Do you get immersed in the book like an actor? And how difficult it is? I mean, what would your wife say about what you're like in the evening or something? I mean, does it sort of overwhelm you sometimes?
Yes, and I like that. That's one of the reasons I like doing it. And to be serious, and writers know that. You're just in that world, and it is the truth. But I think it's not unique to writers. I hate anything that claims a uniqueness of life for writers. I think gardeners have exactly the same experience. They are immersed in it. They're in the cocoon of gardening. And most of the day when they're not gardening, they're thinking, well, I'll dig that up and put it there. And I forgot to do. That's what they're doing. You know, you think you're having a chat with them, but you're not at all. They think, Oh, God, I forgot to take a clipping from that. And that's what they're doing. And with writers, I think it's the same. I think it's part of human activity. I don't like the idea of artists being elevated to any point. We do what we do, and it's part of the world, but it's just a part of the world. For some people, it's an important part, particularly for those of us who do it. But there's other big parts of the world. Yes, you get immersed in it, you get cocooned in it. It's the whole world. Bridget Brophy once had the late Bridget Brophy had a very good phrase. She's writing about the novel, and she said, the novel's a takeover bid. And I thought that was a clever phrase, because I'm taken over when I'm reading a novel. And the novel that I'm really into, I'm inside the characters. And what I was mentioning briefly, lightly a few minutes ago about imagination, I'm just, those people are as real to me as somebody knocking on the door saying, it's time we went out, or whatever. They're as real. It's curious. So yes, you get immersed in it. And that's your world. And you try to, and if you try to, you don't try to do anything. You're sucked into it, and you're trying to make it work. But this word will say exactly, repeat the word urgently, and it will give a real sense of urgency. Come back to that phrase, do that. And again, you're only partly calculating it. That's what's happening. And then you go back and you do calculations on the second, third, fourth drafts to make it work. Yes, you are completely immersed in it, and it's great. It's a part of my life. When I wasn't writing fiction, I missed it terribly. And I was very pleased when it sort of started to come together again.
Thank you. Wonderful talk, and I love your writing too. But one of the things I've been thinking, as you've been speaking today, is, as a writer, are you experiencing very moving things, like with your mother? Are you at the same time thinking, this will make a good story?
Well, no, I am not. And that doesn't... Graham Greene had the famous phrase that a writer must have a chip of ice in his heart. And he describes one scene, I think I've got it right, but people like Tom will correct, but it's nearly right. Is that he was in hospital, and nearby, on a nearby bed, somebody was dying, and he heard the conversations going on, and he used them. He said, and he used them. And I know writers, living writers now, who are using notes all the time, overheard on a bus or all that sort of stuff. And that's one way to do it. I don't. Now, it's just, please, this is no claim to anything except what I am. I don't like that. I like it to be sprawled. And when I start making notes for a novel, I make masses of notes. I mean, for this novel, which is a short novel, I made almost 1,000 notes, 900 and odd notes. Some of them were pages long, some of them were just a couple of words. And then away it goes, and you think, okay, let's go. But I don't listen to, I don't do that. Maybe a lot better writer if I did, I don't know. But it just isn't the way I work. But some do. And there you are.
I just wondered if this event in this tent would somehow feature in your next book.
You mean called Rain in Charleston? I envy writers who can do that. They can pick up an incident or something and turn it into a story that resonates. There's people who can do that. I don't think I can do that. There you go.
My mother lived to be 105, and she had her wits right to the end. And yet now I have my husband who's 85 this year, and he has vascular dementia. The film of Iris and the book probably was the first I would feel to be well known as popular. And dementia isn't a popular subject, but perhaps that paved the way. I just wondered, with regard to myself, you felt a disloyalty about publishing when your mother was alive. I almost feel a disloyalty about referring to my husband today. But he said the other day, is there anyone superior to me? And I had to really, in a nanosecond, think, what does he mean? And so I turned the question back on him and said, in what respect? Because I thought maybe he was thinking about his previous career. And he said, have I got a mother and father? And I said, carefully and gently, I said, no, because if you did, they would be well over 100. They would be 110 or 115, and they've gone. And it was sad that he had to face their deaths again. And I wondered whether you felt that you were able to reconcile your mother with her memory problems.
Well, that's very moving, and I think each of us does it. I lied. She would say, "How's Dad?" And I would say, "It's fine." I lied. And she said, "What's he doing?" "Well, this morning I went up street and he met Tommy Jackson and went to the allotments and then he went in the pub." I lied. She looked at me and she knew I think she knew I wasn't telling the truth, but it would do. I think it's extraordinarily difficult. And yes, I think that the business of it being an illness that dare not speak its name. I didn't write this in any proselytizing fashion. I didn't write this to say dementia can be. I wrote it because it came to me that I wanted to write it. I wrote it because of Grace. I started with Grace, and then there was this daughter. I thought, well, that's my mother, of course. Because what am I talking about? And then put it together. But I think the sooner, which we are doing now, we face it. It's a state of affliction, like any other, except it's seems to be extraordinarily difficult to resolve a way to deal with it at the moment. And we all hope that one way and another they will. All sorts of things have been dealt with. This seems to be extraordinarily difficult, partly because there isn't enough money going into research, but even so, it's very difficult. But it's part of the life of so many people now, and an increasing number of people now. I mean, you can't sweep it under the carpet or not. It's there. And one of the things in this book, which I did not set out to do, but it's true, is the woman who has dementia, based on my mother, is not a constantly unhappy, desperate person. There's loveliness there, there's life there, there's all sorts of stuff there. So I understand what you're saying, that it's something that people used to be. Well, it's one of the strange things about the last century is that shame has lifted from all sorts of things. That people used to be ashamed about having an illegitimate daughter. More than ashamed, but they're not now. And it goes on, and that's lifted. It's like a sort of mist that's lifted, a cloud that's lifted. And that's good, I think. And long may it go on. Because it's raining so hard, you might have to stop here for a few minutes. I mean, you've got two options. You can go if you want, that's fine, and get soaked to the skin. I can ask one or two more questions, or I can read again, or whatever you want. I'm in your hands.
Before my question, may I say it's good to hear someone still using the traditional county names. Cumberland has a much better ring to it than Cumbria. But my question, when you're writing, particularly a novel like this, can you write anywhere, or do you prefer a special place, a special environment? Do you like to have mementos of your mother around you? How important to you is your physical environment?
Well, it's quite important, but because I've always had a job, because although I started writing when I was young and started publishing when I was quite young, when I was 24, I never made enough money to live full-time as a writer. And I didn't want to be a journalist, not because but because I didn't want to write something else. All I wanted to write was novels. So I stumbled into television, which is about as far away from writing as you can get. It's a job which you do with 6 or 7 other people, and it doesn't work unless the 6 or 7 of you work together. The cameraman, the lighting man, the sound man, the director. So and then I'm my own writing, solitary. Where I write was where I found myself. For a long time, I used to love to write in the kitchen. But, you know, children arrived, and that became inconvenient. They seemed to think they could come into the kitchen whenever they wanted. And then I have a study, but I sometimes look at it and I think it looks a bit too important for me. Where else can I go? Now, I like to write. Nowadays, I get up about 5:30, and I'll try to get to my desk as soon after that as I can. And I go into an empty room, often my study. The table isn't quite big enough, really, and just go for it. And if nothing comes, nothing comes. And if it does, write for 4 or 5 hours, and just keep going till I finish. And if it's interrupted, planned interruptions, like you can't go more than midday because there's a lot of work to do on this film you're doing. So remember, click it in that you're going to stop then. And those that week you can't. But basically, I quite like one place, but some people are utterly fetishistic about it. And again, on Brian Johnson, B.J. Johnson, which some of you, whose novels some of you might know, dead now, unfortunately, he used to have to start every book he ever wrote on Boxing Day in the morning in his mother's house. He did. When he was a grown man. Well, there you go. And he wrote some very good books. So there you are. I mean, Trollope wrote on a train up and down to work in London, as you all know, as you know. Gogol wrote in a pub. I wrote when I was on holiday once. I'm not very good on holidays, really. And I was on holiday in Brittany with the children, and I was writing a book called The Maid of Buttermere, and I was really seized by it. And then we had to go away for this blooming holiday for 10 days to Brittany. And I really didn't like it. And we're near a small village, and I found a little cafe. I really did. And I sneaked in, and there was a table at the back, and I took all my stuff, and I could spend hours in there. They didn't know where I was, and I was right here like mad. So, oh, yeah, I've been for a long walk. Isn't it nice weather? Yeah, well, lovely. There was a pool. They played in the pool, and it was fun. We had races swimming sometimes in the morning before I set off. It's anywhere, really. As long as I agree with you about having the same place. That's useful to be in the same place. Mementos, no. No, I just like to be with myself. You're stuck, aren't you?
Well, here we all are, and of course we're all taking away with us amazing memories of Melvyn Bragg, and each and every one of us with something different to tell when we get home. But for myself, with a father who was born in Salford and had a bone shaker, I myself am going away, do forgive me, with this image of Melvyn Bragg careering down a narrow stone-walled lane somewhere in Cumberland on a reconstituted bone shaker with the wind in his hair, and perhaps rather like my father did, hitting a brick, going straight over the wall and ending in a field with a load of cows. Is that okay?
Well, that's his novel. Unfortunately, it didn't happen to me. It could have been an entirely different story.
I'm sorry I hope we're not ending here on a note of trivia.
I'll read a bit, because it hasn't stopped, unless you want to get wet. I mean, please feel free to go. But I'll read one more short bit. My mother very much liked flowers and trees, and it's very strange. That's another beauty that came out of it. This stopping to look at things intently, whether it was trees or the sea, because this is on the seaside, just looking at it. She said, there's so much of it, isn't there? I don't see, where does it all come? There's so much of it. And there was an intensity of looking at it that was, I don't know, it was almost, I suppose if you practice some of those Eastern philosophies and rituals, it's what they do, concentrate on part of nature and just stay there. And she loved flowers. And this is both reference to that, but it's a completely made up incident that happened between her and me, as I say, or her and John, and it didn't, but here we go. The county that had nurtured the daffodils, famously celebrated in Wordsworth's poem, had taken up daffodils as a tourist attraction. They were planted in tens of hundreds of thousands alongside the motorways, on the run into the towns and villages that had close connections with the poet. They were by the lakes, beneath the trees, and in every spare bed in every Cumbrian municipal garden. The public turned official policy into a private craze, and the bulbs were scattered in hedgerows and woodland, at the rim of fields and down farm lanes, in private gardens and window boxes, and lavishly in cemeteries. Mary was ecstatic about daffodils. They besieged the home. This is this nursing home. They filled the vases in her bedroom and in the communal sitting room. They filled her with a delight that John could scarcely fathom, only observe, and feel her pleasure smile deeply on him. And having wrapped her up in almost a mummification, he took her out in the car, daffodil hunting. There was never far to go. He pointed the car down the coast road and slipped into the medieval fortified villages, which now basked in the riches of the Solway farmland, and there they found daffodils in multitudes. I'm going to remember this. I'm not going to write about it, but I'm going to remember it. In multitudes. I thought it was coming to an end. I thought, and now you can go. It's all stopped. And then there they found daffodils in multitudes, as if the sea had swept in across the beaches and deposited a golden harvest of its own to add to the celebration. They went on the main road to Wicton, which was massed with daffodils on either side, rank on rank, like an imperial army on parade, row on deep row, the green and the yellow, swinging in the breeze under the long, high sandstone walls of the railway station, on parade to receive the inspection in motor cars who sped past like royalty taking the salute. He took her beside the nearest park and up to the foothills of the northern fells and into those embedded hill villages alongside the streams and the waterfalls, where quite suddenly and surprisingly, clustered on a verge or on the bank of a ditch, clutches of daffodils grew under those racing clouds as if they'd been poured down from the sky itself, showered golden on the bare fell lands, radiant for those spring weeks, laughing at the slate bleakness of the place, trumpeting happiness. And everywhere Mary went in wonder. "Oh, look," she said. "Oh, look at them. Aren't they beautiful? Look how many, and more. Aren't they just beautiful?" John drove carefully and slowly, and often he would turn and drive back so that you could see again, be utterly absorbed again, and exclaim in rapture again, and be taken out of herself by the beauty of the daffodils. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you, Melvyn. Nothing's going to stop the rain, I think, but I just want to say that certainly from my point of view, I don't know about you, but every time I switch on and tune into In Our Time on Radio 4, I always feel as though I'm being allowed into a very special masterclass on the subject of the day with Melvyn and his guests. But today I feel as though we've been treated to an extraordinarily special, intimate and deeply moving series of insights, for which huge thanks, Melvyn. I think it just shows the value of misremembering. It's been an eloquent, moving, humorous evocation of a different period, and I certainly feel as though I've been transported back to Cumberland. I don't know about you. But I also just wanted to say a huge thanks as well, firstly to Melvyn, but also to our sponsors today, Hurst-Pierpoint College, particularly appropriate, I think, given the subject matter that we've had a college as our sponsor. So thank you to you. None of this would have been possible without your support. And I've thoroughly enjoyed today's sessions. I believe that Melvyn will be happy to sign copies of his book out in the outer marquee where you can also shelter from the rain. But before we do that, I'd like to ask you to join me in offering a vote of thanks to Melvyn.